Hello there. I'm Michael Burns, and I'm so grateful that you've joined me today for this lesson. I want to talk today about the time that Jesus declared war. Now, you might be sitting there going, wait a minute, I don't remember Jesus declaring war. I read a lot of what he said, but I don't remember that. Well, we're going to get into that today and talk about that. But before we do, let me ask a question. If you were going to start a new society, a new start for the human race, and you were starting from scratch, and you would want humans who were strong and wise and resilient and kind and patient and selfless, and we could go on with that. Would you want them to go through easy things in training them to be like that, or hard things? Well, I think the answer is obvious. We've observed this in life and raising children in our own lives, that when we have no opposition and everything is easy and handed to us, we don't turn out very well. We don't respond well. We actually learn and are shaped and formed through challenges, through obstacles, through hard things. In fact, we learn pretty quickly that the obstacle is the way. Now, we often forget that lesson, but it's a real pervasive truth. Keep that in mind as we go through this lesson today. Now, we're going to spend most of our time in the Old Testament, and particularly even the first 11 or 12 chapters of Genesis, which may be even more confusing. Wait a minute, you said you were going to talk about Jesus and the time he declared war, and now you're saying that most of the lesson is going to be in the Old Testament and Genesis. Well, what we're going to do is provide a lot of background, historical, and cultural context to what Jesus was doing and saying. Not all that unlike the time when Jesus was on the road with his disciples and they started to eat grain on the Sabbath. And of course, the Pharisees did not appreciate that and started to question, why are your guys doing that? And Jesus says, well, let me tell you a story about David. And he gives them the historical and cultural background of the story of David to explain what he's doing and what his disciples are doing so that they could properly interpret scripture based on the situation. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to try to get into a little bit of the historical and cultural background, the way that the people of not only the Old Testament, but the New Testament in Jesus' time, the way they view the world and thought. And so what they would have understood and heard when Jesus made his declaration of war. So we're going to ask three questions and try to answer them through the course of this time together today. The first one is, and I think these are pervasive questions that are pretty common, at least the first two, about the Old Testament that I hear quite often. So the first one is, why such focus on one particular nation or people group, which is Israel? Why didn't God work through all the nations or just through all individuals, equally? Why one people group? Well, we're going to get into that. Similarly, why such a focus on the land, the Holy Land, the land of Israel, this one little slice of geography in the middle of the world? Why that? It's a good question. We're going to get into that. And then the third question is do either of the first two mean anything for us today or have any impact? Why should we care about that? So we're going to try to look at those three questions kind of throughout our time together. And coincidentally or not coincidentally, there's going to be a lot of threes in this lesson. It's just kind of the way it worked out. So, okay, let's dive in. The first thing is, in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, it really highlights three separate entities or groups that we need to be aware of to understand what's going on in those chapters. The first is individuals. In Genesis chapter 1, We find God ordering creation, and he comes to kind of the pinnacle. And there's this conversation where he says, let's make humankind in our image and likeness. And then it says God did that. He made human beings, male and female, in the image of God. And so we have individual image bearers. This is important. This is who we are. This is our identity. We'll get more into that in a minute, but we have individual human beings bearing the image of God. Then the second group we see throughout Genesis and beyond, but really highlighted in Genesis is, and we'll use the Hebrew term here, Elohim. Now, some of you may go, oh, I think I've heard that term before. Isn't that the name for God? Well, no, it's not actually. Elohim is the word for a spiritual being of any kind, including Yahweh, God. He is an Elohim, but he also creates other spiritual beings. And sometimes we call them angels. We call, fallen angels. They're sometimes referred to as the divine council, spiritual beings, any number of things. But we'll use the term Elohim. But we see the Elohim throughout the Bible. And keep that in mind, because we're going to look at them from a little different angle maybe than we're used to oftentimes, because we tend to think of spiritual beings only in the individual sense. We think of like our guardian angels and how they, impact our individual lives, and even demons. That tends to get the most of our focus from the dark side forces of the Elohim. And we focus on how they tempt us as individuals towards sin and that kind of thing. But there's a whole nother aspect to the Elohim, which is really important for understanding us as a community of God and understanding the role of our families and all of that kind of thing. The third group that we need to be aware of that comes out key in the first opening chapters of Genesis are the nations, or to use a Greek word, the ethnos, the people groups. So when we say nations, don't quite think of the formalized states that we have today, like the United States of America and Canada and Kenya and, so on. But the nations, the people groups that saw themselves as individual groups and that kind of thing, but, were there. Spread out and had their own geographic areas and would war against each other and all of that. So we have individuals, we have the Elohim, and we have the nations. Now, with those three groups, in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, we find 3 rebellions against God. And that might strike you as odd, like I thought there was just one in Genesis 3. Well, let's look at that. The first rebellion is the one you're probably thinking of. It is with the image bearers, those made in the image of God. And there's a dual aspect to image bearing, which we see in those early chapters. There is, as I said, the individual, the identity. We are all, we all bear God's image. We're made in God's image. That cannot be changed. It cannot be taken. That is our identity. And it's key to understand that, because we live today in a culture that has really assaulted that fundamental idea that God is creator, God is the image giver, God is the identity maker. And when those truths are in place, we can go around with a certain level of self-esteem and confidence and a surety, because we know who we are. We know what our identity is. It's a background decision. It's already been decided for us. I don't have to struggle with who am I? What am I here for? What am I supposed to be doing? I'm an image bearer of God. That's who I am. Doesn't matter. You can't strip that from me. You can't lower me down. You can't take away that. You can try to oppress me, but it's unjust automatically, because we are equal as image bearers. That's the message of image bearing. Any sort of inequality then or oppression is automatically injustice in the biblical worldview because we are all equal. Now, that doesn't mean we won't rise to different levels or work harder or whatever. That's a conversation for another day, but we're talking about at the identity level, at our worth, at our value, our dignity. It cannot be taken away. But in our culture today, we have decided that there is no creator God that gives us our identity. And we've actually made that something that we do now. We create our own identity, and that has created a really bad situation for us. That's untenable, quite frankly. If you go to a zoo and you see a lion, and you'll sometimes see the lion repeat the same thing over and over again. He'll go up against a wall and push off of it and go around the little pond and do it again and again and again for hours. That's an actual state, a mental state called zoochosis. And it basically means the lion has lost his mind because he's been put in an environment that he was not made for. Lions are made to roam and have territory and be predators and hunt and stalk and do all those things. And when they're put in an environment that they weren't made for, they go crazy. And what we see today now is we've created a world where we are the identity makers. And so we're full of stress and angst, and we put it on children at younger and younger ages. You've got to figure out who you are and what you want to be and what your identity is, and all these things that were in the background that were assigned at birth and came from God. Now is up to you. They become foreground decisions. You got to make these decisions. We're not equipped for that. We're not designed for that. And that puts us in another problem because by its very nature, identity is a community, a social type of reality. And so we don't need identity if we're just by ourselves, isolated. Identity is a social thing. And so it demands a witness. If God is the identity giver, then he is our witness, and that cannot be changed. And we can rest assured in that. And no matter what people do to us, we are image bearers. But when now identity is something that we do, and other people don't get to speak into that, but we desperately need them to affirm it. So even if people are to say, I love you, but I don't agree with the choices you've made in your identity, that is not acceptable. That becomes like a violent assault on my humanity. And so we see a society taking on a role that we weren't made for, and we've devolved like that lion into all kinds of anxiety, depression, mental illness, exhaustion, the addiction. We could go on. And it goes back to rebelling against image bearing and the particular way that we've now manifest that in our modern sense. But that's the first rebellion that we see in the Bible, is against image bearing. The second rebellion that we have has to do with those Elohim. Now, one of the frustrating things about the Bible is it describes the effects of the rebellion against the Elohim, and you see rebellious members of the Elohim creating havoc in the Bible, but it never really directly lays out when that rebellion took place, what it was like, what it was about, what was going on. We don't get some of the details of that we might like, but we clearly see that it's taken place. In Genesis 3, there's suddenly a spiritual being tempting Adam and Eve in a rebellious manner. He's the catalyst for the first rebellion. And in Genesis 6, we see the rebellion of the Elohim. I think that's the reference being made there. The sons of God, they come to the daughters of man, and they're trying to, again, cut off image bearing from following God, from doing something. And so we see the consequence of the first rebellion being the humans are cast out of the Garden of Eden. The consequence of the second rebellion is here comes the flood to try to deal with the repercussions of that rebellion. And then the third rebellion we find in Genesis 11. And this is the rebellion of the nations. This is the community part of image bearing. See, the individual aspect of image bearing is the noun. That's who we are. We are image bearers. But the community part of image bearing, where God, says, I want you to go out, bind together, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. We do that in community, and the groups would spread out, but they'd still be equal. They'd still be image bearers. They'd still be unified. And so we have to go from that noun to the verb, where we choose to image God as a community. That's the progression. That's where the rebellious Elohim is always trying to stop it. So before Adam and Eve can go out and spread individual image bearing as a noun into being into imaging God as the verb, Satan tempts them away. Did God really say, oh no, you can be more than image bearers. You can be like the Elohim, like the gods yourself. You can become that. And then we see that in Genesis 6. There's an attempt through breeding, seems to indicate, to stop individual image bearing into flowering into the community imaging that spreads around the world. So following the flood, then, God reiterates his call, go be fruitful, fill the earth, multiply. We see that in Genesis chapter 9. In Genesis chapter 10, then, we start to see the table of nations. It's happening. The nations are spreading. Image bearing is going out across the earth. But then a very interesting verse comes up in Genesis chapter 10, verse 25. And it talks about the earth being divided in the days of Peleg. Now, if we're original readers following the story and hearing it the way we're supposed to, this should screech the brakes. This should be shocking. Wait, division? There's no division in image bearing. If the communities are imaging God as image bearers, being fruitful, filling the earth, there's division. And I believe then in Genesis chapter 11, I think the best way to read this is to say Genesis 11 then goes back and gives us the details of how we got this disastrous division in chapter 10, verse 25, that sort of stopped the flow of the spread of the nations or corrupted it. And what we see there is the third rebellion. We'll call it the rebellion of the people groups, the community, the nations. A group comes to Shinar and they go, we don't want to spread out. We don't want to pick up this role of imaging God, filling the earth and subduing it. They're afraid of doing that. And we don't know all the reasons, but it starts with fear. They're afraid. It's a tough role. They don't want to do it. They want to stop there. They want to shell up. And that's one of the stories of the Bible, is that fear always is a bad starting point, because fear leads us to a desire for strongholds. And so they stop and they start to build a city with technology and bricks, and they build a tower, which, if we dive into all the language there and the ancient context, it's a ziggurat. That's what they're building. We see that same kind of language used in Genesis 11 throughout ancient Near East writings. They're building these towers called ziggurats that they believed called the gods down and became a doorway, a ladder for the gods to come down to them, so that there could be this mutual, we'll take care of your needs, but you provide safety and security for us. See, they were afraid, so they turned to the desire for security, for strongholds, which often then leads to the worship of something other than God. They found safety and identity in something other than God. And that's really what Genesis 11 is about. And so God says, boy, if human beings unite in this rebellion against me and their desire for safety from the other gods and their provision from the other gods, then no, there's going to be no limit to their level of evil, in a sense. And so the final step there, we have fear, safety, or we have fear, and that desire for safety leads to strongholds, which leads to kind of messed up worship, which leads to empire, all the dynamics that are opposed to God, and that results in division. And so God says, okay, this is not my plan, but we'll have to divide. I'll just let you reap the consequences of your desires. Very similar to what we see in Romans 1. God turns them over to their desires. And basically what's happening in Genesis 11, this third rebellion, is they're saying, we want to trust in these other gods. We want other gods. We're turning to these other gods. And so God comes down and he says, if that's what you want, then fine. I'll give you that. You got to be very careful when we start to think we know the way. When it's driven by fear, we know what will bring us safety, because God might just give it to us, and this is exactly what he does. And we find some details of this scattered throughout Scripture. Deuteronomy 32, verses 8 to 9, for example, lay out that what happens here is God comes, and Deuteronomy 32 is looking back to the time of Babel. And God says, okay, you want other gods? Then I'm going to split you into nations, and each nation will be apportioned a god according to the sons of God. Now, some of the modern translations, I think, incorrectly say sons of Israel. I think the best manuscripts and the best case from scholars has been made that wouldn't even make sense, because Israel didn't exist back at the Tower of Babel. It should be translated the sons of God. And that's exactly what happened. So basically God said, okay, you want other gods? You got it. You're a people group. You get a god. That's now your territory. You get a god. That's your territory. And it's called cosmic geography. He splits the world. He apportions it according to these gods. And each nation gets their own god. And he says, you want to find out what it's like to serve other gods? You will have it. And that's the third rebellion. And we see in Psalm 82, later God judges these Elohim, because they were supposed to, God created the Elohim to usher people towards proper worship of God, but instead they rebelled against God, the Elohim, and they manipulated human leaders and nations and people groups and cultures away from God and towards that injustice, away from image bearing. And so in Psalm 82, God says, I called you gods. I gave you the position of gods, but you sowed nothing but injustice, and so you will die like mere. And in Isaiah 24, because there's such a overlap and manipulation of these powers, these Elohim, with human rulers, God says, the kings on earth and the powers in heaven, I will lock them up together. They're basically in cahoots. And so this creates a worldview in the ancient mind where each nation had its own god and its own territory, and that God ruled that territory. And so he was, sovereign over that land. And for instance, if nation went against nation in war, and one nation beat the other, then they would think, oh, that God defeated the other God and is now taken over his land. It was not just nations warring, but the gods warring. And we see that mindset makes a little more sense of some of the passages in the Old Testament. For example, in Daniel, we see talk in Daniel of the angel being stopped by the angel of Persia, the Elohim of Persia, for 21 days because they were trying to go into his territory. And Naaman, the story of Naaman, where he has leprosy, he's healed, washing in the Jordan, and he now realizes that God is the true God. And he goes to Elisha and says, can I have enough dirt, soil from Yahweh's land to take back to mine? Because it appears, we don't know exactly what he was thinking, but it appears that he's thinking, if I want to worship Yahweh, I need his land, because that's how it works. And so even in Acts 17, I think we see that mindset where Paul refers to God has set the boundaries and times of each nation. This is that worldview. God gave kind of each nation a God, and they were led astray by the very God that they wanted. God turned them over to their own desires. So we have these three rebellions. Now God doesn't just leave it there. He's going to restore each one of those dynamics in the human sense. And we see that beginning with this. So now we'll focus on we have the individual, we have the nations, and we have the land. God will restore those three things, because look at what happens in the Old Testament. I'm going to read this passage right after Babel, the very next chapter. In fact, the very next verse, Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. The Lord had said to Abram, so he comes to an individual, to an image bearer, and says, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great. See, remember in Babel, they were trying to make their own name great. He says, I will do this, and you will be a blessing. God will make him a blessing. So we see the three elements. He says, I'm going to restore you as an image bearer. I'm going to restore the land and make you a great nation. So as God is apportioning out the nations, he says, but this land is mine. I'm giving the rest of it over to rebellious humans and rebellious Elohim, but this little slice of land that I'm going to show you, Abram, this is mine. And I'm going to make you a nation who I am your God. Not to punish the nations, but so they can see the difference. So they can see the beauty of what it looks like to worship the one true God, be in communion with him, have the life of image bearing and justice and equality that is supposed to be characteristic of human beings, of image bearers. So he says, that's my land. So that's why we have such a focus on this one nation and one land. It all comes from these rebellions, but God not giving up on humanity. I'm not giving up this time. I will show a way. But this is why how they are in the land. First of all, the fact that God says, this is my land. The other Elohim, the other nations, they knew that. So when God says, okay, now Israel, it's time to possess that land, they very well knew that that was Yahweh's land, that they were staying on it. They would not leave. So when God says, you can leave, and they don't, then God says, okay, then we will have to drive you out. And Israel never goes on a conquest outside of that land. It's simply Yahweh saying, I need my people to take possession of this land so that the nations can see what it looks like to live a restored existence. So that's why it's so important, this land, and it's why it's so important that Israel, that's why so much of the Old Testament is about Israel embracing justice and living out God's version of justice, not a world's version of justice, but God's version of justice, so that the nations can see it and be drawn to it. And when Israel fails to do that, then there is no example of imaging. There is none. And eventually it becomes clear that they cannot do that and will not do that. And God gives them plenty of time, but eventually Israel rebels as well, which is why we won't focus on this so much, but this is why there's so many passages in the New Testament about Jesus being the image of God, the image bearer, the fulfillment of Israel, Jesus. And it's why Jesus had to be human, because God had promised from Genesis 1 that he was going to work in this world through image bearers and give us the choice. We have to make the choice to go from the individual identity of image bearing to the community that is imaging God. And we do that through Jesus. He is the restoration. But God will restore the land. So he comes to Abram and he says, this is the deal. This is what I'm doing. I'm giving you this land, and take care of it. And in Genesis 15:7, it says, I am the Lord who brought you out of the Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land and to take possession of it. And then, of course, later on, as the Old Testament goes on, God tells him, drive out these other nations so that we can set up imaging for the benefit of the other nations. So there's this irony of we got to drive the nations out so that we can do this for their benefit. But in Judges 1, it tells us that Israel failed to drive out the nations. And so in Judges chapter 2, verse 2, he says, you shall not make a covenant with the people of this land, but you shall break down the altars. This is what God told him to do, but he said, yet you have disobeyed me. Why have you done this? And I have also said, I will not drive them out before you. They will become traps for you, and their gods will become snares to you. See, there's that mentality. Now, because you left the nations in, their gods will be in too, and that will be your downfall. You didn't obey. You didn't keep this as God's land. So, but God says, I'm bringing about my ultimate restoration through Abram, through the image bearer, to bring about the ultimate image bearer. And it will start in this land and with his people. That's why it wasn't just an individual. God says, you are also going to be imaging. You'll be a great nation. And in Exodus 19:6, it says, I have made you a kingdom of priests. This is what human beings were originally supposed to be, both kings and priests. And we actually see that in the text. It's kind of hidden in the text of Genesis 1 and 2, because image bearing was a concept directly connected in the ancient world mentality to king. And then in passages like Genesis 2, where it talks, God speaks to Adam and Eve and he says, I give you this land to work it and take care of it. He uses a combination of words there that just look like normal words in English. But in the Hebrew Bible, that combination of words is only ever used of priests in the temple. And the message is kind of clear that the original sort of vocation of human beings was kings and priests representing God. So every human is like a king. Every human has access and connection, and as a priest, a representative of God. And so this is who God's people will be, a kingdom of priests. This is the calling to be the answer to the Babel formula of fear, safety, and stronghold, worship, empire, and division. It's restoring the two aspects of image bearing. Israel was supposed to be the representative, but they resisted that. And we find in the New Testament that it's always been God's plan to have an image-bearing people. Ephesians 1, Paul says this. It was predestined. It was before time. This is always God's plan, was to have an image-bearing people in Christ. In other words, this wasn't just a mistake. This is where the plan is going all along. And you might say, and Romans 8:28-29 says something very similar. This was God's predestined plan all along, was to have a Christ-shaped people. None of this was an accident. You might say, why so much trouble and struggle and obstacle to get to Christ? And I go back to that original sentence, or that original question we had. The obstacle is the way. This is what we must go through to become fully image bearers as we were intended to be. There has to be obstacle and challenge. But so we have this worldview where God has apportioned the nations and the gods and set their boundaries, and then taken just a tiny little slice for himself for the love and benefit of the world, to show them what it would look like to have Yahweh as their God. But the nations are still in rebellion, and they have these Elohim as their authority and their gods and their rulers. And then Jesus comes as the image, and he is put to death by these Elohim. That's their best weapon, death. But he defeats it. He walks into death and walks out the other side. Death has no hold on him. And after having done that, after having resurrected from the dead, he stands in front of his disciples and he says, now, all authority in heaven and earth, in the realms of the heavens, in the realm of the Elohim, and in the realm of earth. I have all authority because I have defeated them and their greatest weapon. And then he says, it's time. Go make disciples of all nations. He has declared war, and really, in a sense, declared his victory already. The war's already done, but now go take back what is God's. All the nations. Yes, the dark forces are still out there and they're still dangerous and they can divide and they can manipulate us, but they're no longer ruling over the nations with an iron fist. God has no longer turned them over to that and hoped that they would come to the light of his land. He's now going on the offensive. Go into those nations, take over them, draw people to me, create outposts of my kingdom, of my land in every place, among every people, and show them what it looks like to be my people. It is the gathering of the nations. So I hope that helps answer those first two questions of why the focus on community and why the focus on the land. But our third question is, do those first two impact us today? Well, I think they do. Obviously, or we wouldn't be doing this lesson, right? I hope that's obvious at this point. There's still a spiritual battle against the powers, but in a different way. But now in Christ, we are still to be these communities. The communities, in fact, are the temple. We are the land. We now take that role of the place where God shows what it's like for him to be God. And in fact, we see that in Ephesians 5 and 6, where Paul starts to, as an example, where Paul starts to use the household codes. Household codes were used, they were a typical tool in the ancient world, where Rome, for instance, would use household codes a lot. And what the household codes did is they would demonstrate, these are our values of our culture, of our society. This is kind of people we are, but we'll demonstrate it by giving you the ideal example of the smallest political unit we have, which is a household. And don't think just mom, dad, brother, sister at that time. These were, the households, multiple generations, families, servants, slaves, all of that kind of operating as an economic, spiritual, political unit, all of that. And then they would say, these are the values. And in those household codes, only the top dog, they called him the pater familia, the leader of the household, the dad, husband, owner, would be addressed in these household codes. And they would tell him all the rights that he had to keep order and the hierarchy and all of that. So Paul says, okay, let me use that tool, household codes. I'm going to show you what type of people we are, what the land looks like today, what imaging looks like, an image bearing. And he does something very shocking. He addresses the social inferiors. That was never done. He didn't address wives or children or slaves, but Paul does. That tells us something very important about the values of this community from the very beginning. And then he addresses them, but in a way that might be very surprising to us. He says things like, wives, submit to your husbands, children, obey your parents, slaves with your masters, and so on. And we look at that and say, well, how demeaning. Why didn't Paul tell them they were equal and free? Well, in their culture, that's exactly what he did. We just don't understand the vernacular. What he's saying there, by addressing them, he's saying, you are equal. You are image bearers. That's your identity. And this is what an imaging community is going to look like. This is what your house is going to look like. We don't have hierarchy. We don't lord it over one another. That's not how we operate. But here's how we're going to train one another. Here's the values we're going to have. And he says at the very beginning in Ephesians 5, verse 21, submit to one another. This is the revolution. We're submitting to one another kind of community. And so, yes, wives, you will still submit to your husbands, but because I've addressed you, know that you're doing it as an equal agent. You are an image bearer. You're not doing it because you're lesser or inferior, have to. You are doing it out of choice to reflect God, to be an imager. And same with children. You don't obey because you have to or because you're lesser than. We do it because this is what we've been freed to do. We've been freed from the tyranny and the injustice of the Elohim. We now have the choice to do it, to submit and love and value one another. He says, this is what it looks like. And so I think the message for us today is to figure out what that looks like in our context, to put God's word over culture. One of the things that really messes up our families is we allow culture to dictate our values and what we do and how we organize and how we train our children and how we run our families. But this is an example of God's wisdom over worldly wisdom, God's way over the way of the Elohim. Do we train our children like this constantly? Are we thinking through? Sometimes, without thinking, we love our children. We want to give them everything that they have. And we're not having them go through the hard challenges. We're not training them to follow the image bearing life. We're just following the whims of culture. So I think we have to understand then that our households, in a sense, are the land. Are we thinking in those terms? Are we like, okay, the way our house runs is an outpost of image bearing, of the new creation of God's kingdom, so that when other people come in who have been influenced by the way of the world and the wisdom of the world and the ways of Elohim, that they will come in and see, that's what it looks like to inhabit justice and to image God. Are we training in that? Are we being a spiritual community that is being restored in God's image bearing? I think those are the challenges for us. I don't want to give a bunch of practical points in this lesson, like, now this means you must do this, this, and this. I think that's for us to figure out as spiritual communities and families with this story in mind. What does it look like to live as though Jesus is the one with all authority, who has declared war and victory in the same sentence? Go make disciples of all nations. That starts with us. How do we embrace and embody the individual identity, the noun part of image bearing in our families, in our children, in our spiritual communities? And then how do we do that together as a community? What does that look like? What does it look like for us to be the land of God, the embodiment of who God wants his people to be for the sake of the world? Those are the questions I would encourage you to dwell on and wrestle with and talk with one another. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope we answered all those three questions at the beginning, and it gives you something to really think about and wrestle with moving forward. Thank you again.